worked with him in the 1980s when I was doing my own PhD, and then for about 15 years I had stayed in touch with him. I did my sabbatical at the Institute of Education, which is now called Institute of Education, University College London. And a number of scholars felt that Bernstein's work is very complex and quite dense conceptually. And what they wanted to do was try to make that work accessible to a wider audience. So there were a number of people asked to write about different aspects of Bernstein's work, and I was asked to write about pedagogising knowledge. And the concept of pedagogising knowledge came from this book, and I know I've shown it before, but it's actually a key book in Bernstein's work. There was a lot of recognition of Bernstein's work in the 1970s when he wrote Class Codes and Control. So people would be really familiar with this book. And there's a classic paper in this book called The Classification and Framing of Knowledge. So a lot of people are aware of Bernstein's work on code theory. And there was a lot of controversy in the United States and the United Kingdom, across Europe, Australia, about Bernstein's notion of restricted and elaborated codes. So many people in the United States in particular constructed Bernstein as a deficit theorist, arguing that somehow his notion of restricted codes was not acknowledging the complexity of the language that working class people and people of colour were using. It was a wrong interpretation because Bernstein in fact was working with a number of linguists, including Michael Halliday, etc. But there were different kind of political contexts, and taking a concept out of the kind of work that Bernstein was doing in London, transporting it to the US context and a different set of debates, it got interpreted in a particular way. So a lot of people associated Bernstein with this code theory work that emerged in the 1970s, and then they thought, is this person going to produce anything particularly new? And this book came out, which again was incredibly dense, and it came out in 1990, but he had been working on a lot of these ideas all through the 1980s, and because I had worked with him, I was familiar with that kind of work. This particular work, Bernstein engages with the philosopher Foucault's work, and so he brings out the notion of discourse, because Foucault had a theory of discourse, had a theory of power-knowledge relations. What Bernstein does differently is that he connects the notion of Foucault's notion of discourse to pedagogy. And so he brings it into the education domain and says, yes, Foucault talked a lot about the discourses in medical institutions and how medicine gets normalized in a particular way within prison institutions, the discourses of sexuality, but he never deals with the discourses of pedagogy or of education systems. And that's where Bernstein's work sits nicely. There was no other theorist doing that kind of work at the time. So that's how I came to write that particular paper. Look, if you look at some of the diagrams in the book, and I'm going to show this one diagram, and that one's on page 72, and then these are in the slides. There's another one on 187, but in fact the whole book's full of diagrams, seriously. And then there's a really complex diagram, where he tries to link some of the concepts that he's developed at the classroom level to the big picture of what's happening in education systems at a nation-state level and at an international level. So the key concepts in that book is about the structuring of communication, both at the level of the classroom, between the classroom and the local community, and between what happens at the classroom and education departments. So, for example, how curriculum gets produced, how it gets translated or recontextualized is Bernstein's term, how it gets actually produced at a national level and also at an international level. And what Bernstein was really quite good at was trying to, Michael Apple talked about these diagrams. He developed these quite complex diagrams trying to understand the specialization of educational communication. And he'd go to look at the teacher-student relationship, and he'd look at that as a pedagogic relationship. And he'd look at the temporal and spatial relationships in terms of that relationship. So by temporal and spatial relations, I mean what gets taught. How does it get taught? How quickly does it get taught? Where does it get taught? What's the spatial configuration of the classroom? What gets brought out? What gets left out? And he does that kind of analysis, or should I say he develops concepts to think about the kind of work that happens at that level. And then he says, well, wait a minute, the classroom isn't in isolation. It's a part of a bigger education system. So let's look at that big education system. So then he looks at the classroom in relation to what's happening at a regional level, what's happening at a state government level, what's happening at a national level, and then looks at it in terms of that nation state doesn't stand alone, it's connecting to international organisations like the OECD. But there's one other thing that he does. He never does it just in a point of time. He's actually doing a historical analysis of education. So he builds on Durkheim's work, and he's looking at the evolution of education systems over a period of like 500 years. So he'll go, wait a minute, this thing called schools, where did they come from? The way that schools are organised now is not the same as the way that they were organised 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So where did this idea of schooling come from? Now, what's the pattern of organisation of time and space? How has that changed? So he gives you concepts to think about the work of schooling. Not as a lens to read schooling, which is what some people do. They'll take his concepts and go, God, they're complex. Now, how can I do a Bernstein analysis of what's going on there? He never did that. It was ideas to think with and about. And because he does those rich diagrams, it's a way of trying to develop maps of schooling. I think I would first say to students, go and read one of his earlier papers. So start there. Start with the paper on classification and framing of knowledge, because I think it's a crucial paper. Now, because he was working in that same field with the same kind of concepts over 40 years, it's very difficult for a student to say, pick up this book, or even pick up his latest book, which, given he died in 2001, to read that book and really understand it without understanding that 40-year history of where those ideas came from. So I would say, go and read this book and see that particular chapter, Classification and Framing of Knowledge, and see if those ideas are useful for you to think about what happens in schools, what happens in education systems. Now, a lot of students will say, yeah, there's something there that helps me think about these ideas. Now, once they've done that, then I would probably give them the paper, the Pedagogising Knowledge paper, because it actually helps students to think about where does this knowledge that gets taught at the classroom level come from. Now, even if you're not just looking at schools, if you're looking in your case, Nina, about young girls and how they get to school using bicycles, you might then think, well, could Bernstein's work be useful there? And it does, because a pedagogic relationship for Bernstein is a relationship between a teacher and a student, one who is responsible for passing knowledge to another. So you don't even have to use the notion of teacher and student. You could use the notion of an educator and an educant. He also says, well, wait a minute, that relationship is similar to the psychoanalytic relationship between an analyst and a patient. So there's something specialised in that relationship where knowledge is passed from one to another. So you look at any of these kind of complex relationships and think, what are some of his concepts? Let's go to classification and framing. Is that useful? Well, classification refers to the boundaries around categories of knowledge, around people, around organisations. Framing refers to how knowledge passes over those boundaries, who controls the passing of knowledge, at what rate. So you start with those concepts and then you build out. And that way you develop quite a complex set of thinking tools. Now, that doesn't mean that they stay static. I think that's another thing that people get a little bit confused with Bernstein. The theory was constantly evolving over time. And again, because he passed away in about 2000, it's now 17 years since his death. He would expect us, I would assume, not that I've talked to him recently, but he would expect the theory to keep evolving and changing as times change, because the problem keeps shifting. And then you look at the concept and go, well, does that actually work? No, I have to modify it because it's a concept to think about what's going on. So there's got to be that dialogic relationship between what you're seeing in the empirical world and these ideas you're using to think about the empirical world. That is a good question. So I'm going to have to go back to my own history. I was a primary school teacher. I started doing my Bachelor of Education Studies part-time as a teacher. I accidentally went into an honours course because one of the lecturers said, if you've ever thought about doing a PhD, you might think about doing an honours course. So my journey into it was a little bit accidental. And my supervisor for my honours happened to be an anthropologist, sociologist. Bernstein actually comes from a anthropological basis and a sociological basis, and he had been reading some of his work. He gave me a paper. In fact, it was the paper on the structuring of pedagogic discourse. I struggled to read, and I thought, I can't really make sense of this, but let me try. So I tried to make sense of it. I wrote something for my honours dissertation, and my supervisor at that time said, well, I then managed to get first class honours, said, well, are you thinking about doing a PhD? So I did. I started trying to understand the theory a bit more, and he said, oh, why don't you send a copy of your paper to Professor Bernstein? Really? Okay. So I did, and he responded, and he said, come and work with me. So it was, in a sense, accidental journey. And he was such a great colleague and a mentor that I learned an enormous amount in the process of working with him. And the experience that I'm talking to you about, where he would say, well, let's have a look at your data. And he would actually read the data with me. I think Michael Apple talked about that story too. He'd read the data and he'd have these pieces of paper and he'd draw these complex diagrams and go, do you think this is what the data's saying to us? Well, let's have another play with these diagrams. And that's how he kind of developed the theoretical ideas himself. It was often from the ground up and also from the top down. So it was that abduction notion, not just induction or deduction, but a combination.